and welcome to the Teaching Together podcast, where we celebrate and share the glows and grows of teacher life. I'm Grace.
And I'm Sierra. Each episode on the podcast, we like to take a few minutes to celebrate our glows or share our grows from the weeks gone by. This week, I have a huge glow to share, which is something that occurred totally outside of the classroom, but I'm just so excited. I got put on coaching this softball team on Tuesday Sport, which is very ironic because I know nothing about softball. But have actually really enjoyed learning about that sport this term. And I've gotten so invested in it. And our precious team lost every single one of their games until the last game that they had for the term, because the following week is going to be a bye. So this was our last game of the competition. And we were a man down, someone was away. So we were playing with a short team. And we drew.
Oh my goodness.
It was actually so funny because the other team was batting first. And the way that we play it in school is that once there's 5 home runs, we just change over. Otherwise, the innings could go forever.
Yeah.
And the other team got 5 and then we did a changeover. So I was like, man, this is going to be a bit rough. And then our team got 5 and then it was changeover again. And then they got another 5, and then we were going to run out of time for us to have another go. And so normally that means that they will just take the score from the first innings. They won't have an unfair advantage because one team got a chance to bat and we didn't finish. But anyway, we had 5 minutes to go and we thought, we'll just let it play out and see what happens. And in the 5 minutes of our team batting at the end, we got 4.
Stop.
And so it ended up being called anyway, and it was still called a draw because they had to, we weren't out, so they had to just take the score from the previous innings. But I don't know, I was just so excited and we had so much fun, and I wish that I could actually play softball. But as my friend on Instagram posted this week, if you can't play, coach.
Wow, what sound advice. So I have a massive glow for this week. In Kindergarten Blue, we are learning to read some very basic, what we call CVC words, which is a word that has a consonant, a vowel, and then a consonant, because we have learned a grand total of 4 sounds. We know M, S, T, and A. So we can sound out and read mat, sat, at, am. Mm-hmm. And we did all of that as a class, and it was so wholesome, and I was just so excited to be the one that got to teach these kids how to read for the first time. And I made sure to hype them up so much. I was like, guys, you just read words all by yourself. You guys are amazing. Give yourselves a pat on the back. I really went all out because I want these kids to love reading because reading's kind of important to be able to do. But it was just so exciting. And as someone who loves reading, I'm a massive bookworm. And in another life, I would have been some kind of literature professor at, a British university or whatever. It made me so happy that I was teaching these kids a really fundamental skill and that they were actually getting it. They know 4 sounds and they can say some words now. It was so rewarding. And they're going to have forgotten it all by the next time I teach them. But that's okay because we're in kindergarten. But yeah, that was just really, really exciting and very wholesome.
That's so cool. I remember sitting with my little sister and having her, doing her home readers with her. For context, I'm 17 years older than my youngest sister. So when she was learning to read words, I was well and truly finished school. But it is so exciting when they're sounding things out and putting things together and seeing their little brains go, wow.
Yes, and just hearing them go, at, sat, and you're like, oh my goodness, that's so exciting. Yeah, it's the best. And hearing the whole class do it, and they're just so cute, and it really warmed my heart. It really did. And I told them before we even started the lesson, I was like, guys, we're going to learn to read words today. It's very exciting. It's a big deal. And I don't know if my enthusiasm caught on, but I was having a great time. So that's all that matters.
That's right.
So last episode, we got into the nitty-gritty of emails and some specific strategies for maintaining a healthy work-life balance, including Sierra's favourite, schedule send. If you're feeling particularly time poor at the moment, we highly recommend giving that episode a listen.
For today's episode, we are going to be taking a look at the invaluable members of our school community that are teaching assistants and the ways that we can best use them in our classrooms. Grace and I both started our teaching careers as TAs, or if you work for the department, SLSOs. We're going to be discussing what the research says about the most effective ways to utilize TAs for the benefit of teachers and students, as well as spending some time reflecting on our personal experiences and how they've shaped our interactions with the TAs in our own classes now as teachers. But first, it's time for tea.
So I am drinking something that's kind of different for me, actually, which is an Irish breakfast from good old Twinings. I don't usually do a breakfast tea of any description because I don't really like them. However, Sierra did make mine with a little bloop of milk.
That was the actual measurement. A bloop.
Yes, it comes with a hand action and everything. And it was quite comforting. It was actually really, really nice. As for someone who really likes green teas and herbal teas and stuff, it was a nice change. What about you? What are you drinking, Sierra?
Oh, I'm just enjoying a plain old English breakfast, but from a brand that I'm not very familiar with, actually. Impra?
Never heard of it.
I think that's how you say it. Anyway, mine has more of a bloop of milk rather than a bloop, and it's good. Anyway, thinking about tea and being a TA, I drink so much tea when I was a TA. I worked out of the library a lot as our sort of home base. There was lots of little breakout spaces and stuff in the library, so that was really good for especially if you were doing one-on-one or small group kind of sessions. And in the library, there was a little kitchenette, and our beautiful librarian kept the tea bags stocked with such a range of delicious teas, and I probably just drank them all day, which was why I started getting into drinking hot water as well, because I was just drinking so much tea and coffee and getting to the end of the day and being like, wow, I haven't had any water today and I'm really thirsty. And I would just drink a whole liter of water at the end of the day. So I started filling my mug with hot water in between teas to make sure that I was hydrating as well.
That is concerning behavior. It just makes me feel uncomfortable. You just straight up drink hot water on its own.
I actually really love it now. And so I'll have my coffee on the way to work, and then often once I get to work, I'll then have a hot water.
No, I'll have a hot water. What is wrong with you?
I'm not sure. Look, I had the same opinion initially, but don't diss it till you try it.
Oh, I'm dissing it.
I remember my mum's friend coming over for afternoon tea one day, and I was putting the kettle on, and she was like, I'll just have a hot water, thanks. And I was like, but that's what?
Not a thing.
I get it now. I really do. But anyway, for the 3 years that I worked as a TA, the first year I spent in a primary setting. So I was in a K-12 school. The first year that I was there, I worked with the primary teachers in the primary classrooms, doing just a lot of general classroom support, being in the room for their sort of literacy and numeracy sessions. And so I would float from class to class kind of on a half hour or hour basis to get around to each room for kind of their maths lesson of the day. And then in the afternoons, I would usually do multi-lit, doing the reading tutor program, which I really enjoyed. And I continued to do that for the next 2 years that I was there. And then my in-class support kind of transitioned to kind of two different things. Sometimes I would support in TAS classes, so food tech and textiles, literally as just a practical assistant, which worked well for me at the time because that's the area I was training in. So it was kind of helpful for me. But also then I would shadow some students who had IEPs and things into their other English and maths classes. And I had a handful of students that I would meet with weekly for one-on-one intervention. I don't know about you, but I think working as a TA was like the best thing for becoming a teacher.
Oh, 10 out of 10. Like having in-classroom experience, because at the beginning of most of my placements, I would just observe for a couple of days, and that's what you're doing as a TA. I was doing some after-school care work as well as doing my teacher assistant stuff. And one of the girls I worked with at the after-school care program was like, oh my goodness, like I'm so jealous, like that's such good experience. And I thought, actually, yeah, it is. I'm in a really privileged position as a university student at the very beginning of my degree to be in the classroom. And before I ever became a full-time teacher, I had 4 years of classroom experience.
Yeah. It's like it totally eradicated the need to do an observation prac, which thankfully I didn't have to do, but I did know some people studying at other places that literally had a whole placement where it was just observation.
Yep.
And I think also working across primary and secondary for me was very insightful and just observing so many different teachers, the way that they manage, the things that they do that I would want to adopt and the things that I observed that I didn't so much want to adopt. It was just so helpful. And I highly, highly, highly recommend it to any pre-service teacher or someone who's thinking about going into teaching. It is just invaluable experience. And for me, it was like the only thing that kept me persisting with my degree. Like I was actually not enjoying my study very much at all, but being in that environment and seeing, like working alongside teachers and seeing what I was working towards was the motivation that I needed to just stick with it.
Yes, completely agree. Everything you just said, I completely agree.
Yeah. I think one thing that has, I guess, maybe shocked me a little bit from that experience to now is that I remember sometimes when I was a TA, you'd rock up to a classroom and the teacher might say to you, oh, actually, we don't really need you this period, we're actually just watching a documentary or whatever it is. And, in the moment it might feel, oh, great, I've got some extra time to just go and prep some other things or whatever. But I also remember thinking that I would be better at utilising teachers' aides when I was a teacher, because I knew what it was like to be the person rocking up at the classroom and being told that you weren't needed, or rocking up and staying in there and just kind of having to be like a silent mannequin at the back of the room, feeling like you don't really know your place in that space because it feels like the teacher didn't know that you were coming and all that sort of stuff. And so I used to think I'd be really good at that, but I've realised that it's really hard.
It is really hard. Surprise, surprise.
So we're here today to discuss what the research says about how we can use our TAs well to effectively support our kids, because the research actually shows us that often we don't plan for effective implementation of TAs as a resource. Not that we want to dehumanize our teaching assistants to a thing, but they are a resource and we need to put time and effort into planning how we're going to use them well. Otherwise, the typical way that TAs often end up being used in a classroom actually has been shown to have a negative impact on student progress and learning.
The basis of our conversation today is a report called Making Best Use of Teaching Assistants, which is a fantastic resource that we'll link in our show notes. Highly, highly, highly recommend it if you're a teacher, if you're a teaching assistant, if you're thinking of being either. It's very readable, actually really interesting, and we're going to go into a lot of depth in this episode. It was originally published by an independent charity from the UK called the Education Endowment Foundation, whose purpose is to look into how to break the link between socioeconomic status and educational achievement. And since then, an Australian organisation called Evidence for Learning re-released this report and adapted it for an Australian context. It's really fascinating. And before we go into a lot of detail about the 7 recommendations that this report makes, I thought I might just break down some of the pros and cons of using a teaching assistant. And just to preface that with, the cons of using a teaching assistant come when it's not being done effectively. So usually it's because the teacher has not prepared enough or wasn't even aware they had a TA timetable into their class, and the TA is just not being made the best use of as a resource. And similarly to Sierra, I thought I was going to be so much better at managing TAs than the teachers in whose classrooms I was a TA, but I'm not doing a very good job, in all honesty. But the pros of using TAs are that they can definitely increase student confidence and motivation, because sometimes there are those students who just need someone to go alongside them and keep them on task and just nudge them along. And you can definitely have more of a personal relationship with the smaller group of students that you work with as a teaching assistant, which is a bit of a double-edged sword. And if you're using your TAs well, you can also ease teacher workload and stress. For example, laminate this, cut this, mark this, whatever. But actually at the school that I'm currently working at, we have been explicitly discouraged from doing that. And the other pro, which also could be a bit of a double-edged sword, is that TAs have an instructional role, which is because you might ask a TA to, break down an assessment task with a student, or listen to this student read, or help them answer questions, or blah, 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 blah. And that's kind of in their job description. They are an informal educational tool, but we need to be prepared and use them as such. In saying that, jumping into some cons quickly, the use of TAs is not leading to improved academic outcomes. And I inserted a shocked face emoji after that on our notes, because I thought that was absolutely astonishing, even though in my experience as a TA, I found this to be true. I just thought that was really interesting. And in a way, it made me feel better, but it also made me feel worse. Also, if TAs are being used ineffectively, you can have those students, those very needy students who become over-dependent on their TA. They become like a personal assistant to that student, and then the student might become isolated from the class or the classroom teacher or whatever, which obviously doesn't help. And referencing one of the double-edged swords that I said earlier, TAs are not trained teachers, but they often have to teach. And potentially that might be a restructuring of our expectations of TAs or our expectations of teachers, or how we prepare to have TAs in our classrooms. But I think any TA can tell you they're teaching most of the time. Yeah. If TAs are not being used effectively, they might also just be used to tick a box, like, can you just get this kid to do their work, please? Which sometimes is very valid, but if that's happening all the time, potentially you're not making the most of a very valuable resource that is your TA. Mm. And the last con before we jump into the recommendations, teaching assistants are almost exclusively deployed to assist those underperforming students, which means that they're actually not spending as much time with the teacher as their peers, which means that they're missing out on some really important instruction and could actually worsen their results. And there was a sentence from the report that I just thought got to the point. The net result of this deployment is that TAs in mainstream schools regularly adopt the status of primary educator for pupils in most need. And not that TAs aren't capable, but they're not expected to be the primary educator for these students. And so that's where it can be a little bit detrimental to the student.
Especially if it's context specific, like, science or design or something like that requires some up-to-date knowledge and understanding of how that particular subject works, and they can really quickly feel out of their depth. One of my TAs that I work with quite closely at the moment this year is regularly in my senior design and technology class, and she'll often come to me and say, I just feel so out of my depth with this concept. And I try to touch base with her really regularly, and we actually sat down and planned out like several weeks worth of learning together, but only because we happened to have a day where that cohort were out on an excursion and she was timetabled to be with me. And so I said, hey, instead of class, let's sit down and plan out a map basically for the rest of this term, and we'll see how we go. But that opportunity to sit and plan together really felt like a little bit of a luxury. There's not a lot of time for that to happen. And so, by me being able to have some input with her, I know that when she comes in, she's got a strategy and a plan for how to move forward with the content that we've sort of pre-agreed to, and I've tried to bring her up to speed on that context. But she will still say, do you think it's going okay? I'm a bit out of my depth here. And so I think as teachers, it's really important for us to be checking in with our TAs as best we can to sort of make sure that they actually understand and feel confident with what we are teaching. And it's important to make time for that, but it's hard to make time for that. The article goes on to make 7 recommendations, like Grace said. These are recommendations that have come out of research into how TAs are being used and what is actually ineffective and then what is proven to be effective. And the first recommendation is that TAs shouldn't be used as an informal teaching resource for low attaining pupils. So this is to say that TAs shouldn't be used as the teacher substitute for low attaining pupils. And really, I think anyone would agree that we want these kids to have more exposure to the expert teacher than to kind of be just trying to be prodded along to, quote unquote, get their work done. I think this is often a typical deployment and way that TAs are used is because often they will just sort of arrive at your door and you kind of realize, oh, that's right. Someone's here with me and I haven't really planned for an effective activity where they can be super useful, or I haven't had a chance to email them beforehand and let them know what we're doing. And so they end up kind of just hovering around the students that they know need more help. And because they've got a helper, as a teacher, you're then naturally sort of filling in the gaps everywhere else. And I know that's definitely what I did when I was a TA. I knew who my students were that I was looking out for, and you would naturally kind of want to go and help them when really I am not the expert in Shakespeare or algebra or whatever we were doing in that space. And unless the teacher has had time to think about how they want you to be used in that period, you're naturally just going to gravitate towards trying to be helpful in a relatively unstructured way.
Yeah. In my very first year of being a TA, I was assigned a single student who was in year 5, and we would do maths for the entire middle session. So between recess and lunch, we would just be doing maths. And after we would do the warm-up as a class, the classroom teacher would then send me out with this student to do some maths games just to build some very basic skills. And really, thinking back on it now that I have some more experience and knowledge, I would suggest that maybe 10 minutes, 15 max would be appropriate for that kind of thing. But I was doing it for like an hour and 15 minutes. And it was just very boring for me, for the student. And he knew that he was being separated from the class because he was 11 and he could look into his classroom and see all his classmates doing other things, and he was stuck with me. And I just felt like I was getting nowhere. But because I was at the very beginning of my teaching degree and I was a freshly accredited, if you will, teaching assistant, I didn't really know how to fix the problem. I didn't know what to do about it. And I was being used as a very ineffective teacher substitute because this student was just so far, academically, so far below his peers. But I think in that specific case, potentially integrating him in a different way into the class would have been quite beneficial. But it was just easier for the teacher to go, hey, can you just please take this student so I can deal with the 25 other kids who are in this classroom. And now that I'm a teacher, I can kind of sympathize with this teacher and why they did that. But I also feel bad for this kid who is no longer in year 5, who was just bored out of his mind every maths lesson. So if that's not the way to use TAs, the second recommendation actually gives some instruction on how to use them properly. And it just says, use TAs to add value to what teachers do, not replace them. So you need to be supplementing the teacher with the TA. Like they're a teaching assistant. They should be enhancing the overall effectiveness of the teacher. You're a dynamic duo, if you will. And I was saying before to Sarah when we were talking about this that a teaching assistant kind of allows the teacher to be in two places at once. And so you really need the TA and the teacher to be on the same page. And some of the things that the article goes into specifically might be rotating roles. So you might have, for example, if you're doing reading groups, you might have the teaching assistant reading with one group of kids one day, and then the next day the teacher will be reading with the kids and the teaching assistant will be doing the other groups or whatever, so that over the course of a week or a fortnight or whatever your cycle is, the teaching assistant and the teacher both get to work with everybody. We both found this next suggestion actually pretty interesting, about making the teaching assistant more visible during whole class instruction. So, for example, getting them to scribe answers on the board or getting them to demonstrate something rather than them sitting with the kids listening, which is what Sarah and I both have experience with and what the TAs in my classroom often do.
But or just hiding up the back, feeling like they can't be part of the lesson until you invite them to be.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I actually love that idea so much and I really want to implement that. I think that would be really cool. Another specific suggestion from the article was to have TAs rove around to flag with the teacher students who are struggling so that, like I was saying before, you can kind of have the teacher in two places at once.
The other thing that it said, which I thought was fabulous, particularly in my context, and I'm sure other teachers would find it the same, is that things like correcting spelling, grammar, and writing is hard to do when your focus is not spelling, grammar, and writing. So if you're teaching in another context and you're asking students to write a response to something, you might be the one moving around the room giving feedback on the content and the quality of their response, while the TA can actually be providing feedback on another whole class goal, such as we're going to be writing in complete sentences, or we're making sure that we're using punctuation and all those sorts of things that seem to sort of slip away when they aren't made the priority for the class. There's an excellent book, which I've probably spoken about before, called The Writing Revolution, and it provides heaps of practical strategies for how you can and should be teaching writing in subject-specific contexts. And so writing has become much more, present in my mind as I'm asking my students to engage with what we're learning. But it's definitely not easy or feasible even for me to have time to correct all of their spelling and grammar as I'm going along, reading their written responses. And so that's definitely a way that I could see a TA enhancing the teaching in that phase. The third recommendation is to have TAs help pupils develop independent learning skills and to manage their own learning. Grace mentioned before that it can quite often be the case that a student who works very closely with a TA can often become really quite dependent on them and just expect them to do a lot of the thinking and engaging for them. The article proposes this really, really helpful framework for guiding TAs in the best way to support students and the types of interactions to use with them when they are engaging with them in their learning. We will put this in the show notes for you to have a look at yourself. But basically, the framework that it provides starts with self-scaffolding. So as the TA is there working with the student, the TA should be observing the pupils and actually giving them time to process and think through the learning. I guess assess to see how are they approaching the task, can they problem solve as they go, and then actually talk to them at the end, about how well they did that, what are some strategies that they might need to start practicing, things like that. So always we want to start with self-scaffolding. If the TA, through their observation, is noticing that that's not really working, they can move on to prompting. So that would involve asking the questions that might help the students to engage in their knowledge, like, what's your plan for this? Or how might you tackle this one? Or what do you need to do first? Those kind of prompting questions that are going to help them to scaffold their thinking and draw on the knowledge that they have, but they just don't quite have the skills to know how to attack something. If even those questions aren't doing enough, the next thing that the TA can try is cluing. So often the student knows the strategy or knows the knowledge for the problem, but just can't bring it to mind. And so the TA could use clues that have been worded as a question to give them a hint in the right direction. And the advice is always start with a smaller clue, and then I guess you can gradually make the clue more and more obvious. We don't want to jump in too far so that we remove the thinking for them. We want to, as much as possible, clue and prompt them to the right answer before we show them the right answer. If the clues still aren't enough to assist the student to engage with the learning, the next thing that the TA can do is model it. So if it's a totally new skill or strategy, obviously, prompts and clues are not going to do much. There's no existing knowledge for the student to draw on because it's an entirely new thing. So in that case, the TA, when they are a confident expert in the area, so again, this requires collaboration with the teacher on the concept, but when the TA is a confident and competent expert in this area, they can actually model while the pupil watches and listens. And then the pupil can try the same step immediately afterwards. So it's that element of practicing and observing and then practicing and observing. So that's really key if it's a new skill. The last strategy should be really the last resort, and it involves correcting students, so actually providing them the answers. Occasionally that's appropriate, but we should always be aiming for modelling first, because by correcting the student, it takes away all of the independent thinking. There's no onus put on them to engage with the learning. We still want kids to be independent thinkers, even if maybe the thinking that they're doing is scaffolded.
Yeah, and it is scaffolding. It's not, I'm going to take your hand and walk you every step of the way while you have your eyes closed.
Yeah.
The fourth recommendation seems to be one that makes all the other recommendations possible, which is to ensure that TAs are fully prepared for their role in the classroom, which means that, obviously, they need to have training. You need to be trained in the pedagogical approaches of the school you're employed in, and that the onus is on the school to actually professionally develop you. And it's super duper, super important. At my previous school, they didn't really know what to do with learning support on professional development days.
I was literally about to say the same thing.
We were kind of just given busy work.
Yeah.
And it was, as grown women, it was so insulting. And the head of learning support, because it was a K-12 school, she would often have other things to do on PD days, and she was also employed as a teacher, not as a TA. So her requirements were a bit different, which meant she couldn't be with us and couldn't provide the quality professional development that she really would have liked to provide us. So she just kept us occupied with like videos and podcasts and things, and we're all kind of like, this is not helping us in any way. It was incredibly frustrating.
There's also no like expectation on like once you have your Cert 3 in education support, which is the typical qualification in New South Wales, there's not like an ongoing need for professional development. There's no like accreditation process.
No, I got my certificate and that was
it. Whereas as a teacher, once you're accredited, you know, there's that expectation that you've got your certain amount of hours, that you've got a log of professional development. And being a little bit of a nerd, I was engaging in my own professional development anyway because, you know, I find it fascinating. But there's no like, yeah, it did really feel like we were excluded from the same type of PD that all other teachers were doing, or we were doing the same PD as everyone else and it was totally irrelevant to our thing. Like there was no, no effort made to actually upskill TAs in how to be a good TA.
Yeah.
I think that's something that's really missing.
Yeah. And it's very specific and specific to the context of the students you work with and the school and all that stuff, which leads to the next point under this recommendation that the TA should understand the lesson and what will be delivered in advance, which, as Sarah and I have admitted, we're not the best at informing our TAs of what will be happening, but communication is key. And I actually worked as a casual teaching assistant for a little while, and there were lots of students with quite significant learning needs at this school, and often I was assigned to a specific student in year 7 if I was called in to replace someone. And this student had very significant physical and mental disability. And I honestly had absolutely no idea what I was doing because I was a casual and I was just kind of thrown in there. And this is actually quite a drastic example, but I was completely unprepared. I remember I was just having a terrible day. I felt like I was doing a terrible job. And I was on the verge of tears, and the beautiful boy from year 7 said something along the lines of, you know, don't be too hard on yourself, it's not your fault or something. And it was so wholesome. And I was just like, thank you, child. Like, this is so lovely of you to say, but I also felt really bad because I felt like I should have been more prepared and shouldn't be in this situation in the first place. And again, this is quite a specific and drastic example because I was a casual teaching assistant and I was brand new. But this is what can happen if we as teachers are not supporting our TAs and making sure that they know what they're walking into and making the best use of them. So recommendations 5 and 6 are actually quite intertwined. So we're going to cover them together. So recommendation 5 is to use TAs to deliver high quality one-to-one and small group support using structured interventions. And recommendation 6 is to adopt evidence-based interventions to support TAs in their small group and one-to-one instruction. And Sierra and I both have experience with the multi-lit literacy intervention program, which we actually thought was a really good example of small group structured evidence-based intervention. And I liked using it as a TA because it is explicit direct instruction. It is completely scripted. It comes with all the resources you need. So it has a lot of different like letter tiles and flashcards and all that fun stuff. It covers individual sounds. It covers sight words, which they call tricky words because they're little kids when they're doing mini lit and they're in year 1 and 2. And they recommend that you don't deliver the program to more than 6 kids at a time. And I actually really loved it because as a teacher's assistant, it was the closest I could get to teaching. It is very repetitive. Sometimes the kids get bored of it. But the fact that you're in small groups, it means that the teacher's assistant, you can really form relationships with the kids and it's a lot easier to observe how they're going. In relation to the evidence-based thing, all the multi-lit program derivations, they all have regular testing built in. The teacher's assistant can give that to the teacher and say, this is the evidence of how they're going, which is super duper helpful with communication and all that sort of stuff. And in the younger years, in the early primary school, it's also explicitly related to what they're learning in class, especially because we use initial lit at my school, which is the kindergarten year 1 whole class program. So if you're then having kids pulled out of class to do mini lit as well, the links are right there, which this report emphasizes that you need to make explicit links between what you're doing in class and what the teacher's assistant might be taking kids out of class to do, so the kids feel like there's a purpose and that all their learning is interconnected and meaningful and relevant, and not just I'm being taken out of class to play a random game or whatever, and then I jump back in. Like, it all is connected, which we know helps learning. It makes learning easier. I was a big fan of mini-lit as a teaching assistant, also because it was super easy to prepare. And as a teaching assistant who was going through my teaching degree, before I'd done any placement, I had done mini-lit, which meant I knew how to handle kids. I mean, 6 of them, not a whole class. But I knew how to handle kids and how to make corrections and how to observe where the learning was happening. I think it's super helpful, and I personally quite liked it.
The other thing that's really good about multi-lit in all its variations is that its intention is to be short and regular. So one of the things that the article recommends is that evidence-based interventions should be regular, and they should be, shortish regular, no more than 45 minutes, which I think is what you said the multi-lit sessions were. And when I was doing the reading tutor program, that was like maybe 10 to 15 minutes with a student 3 to 5 times a week. So it is that regularity, which is key, and also collecting some data. So the other thing it talks about in the article is about actually monitoring the success of those one-on-one and small group interventions. Simply saying that we do these interventions with these students is not enough to say that we are supporting their learning. And the great thing about those really well-researched, well-structured interventions is that there are often assessment points and things built in so that you can monitor and track student progress. And for the kids themselves to see them progressing through different levels and things, I think that's really encouraging for them.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago with one of my mini-lit groups, my favourite mini-lit group, actually, I miss these kids so much. We had some sound boxes, and there was a box for each sound, and we were doing three box words, so like 3 letters, 3 sounds kind of thing. And then we quote unquote graduated to 4 boxes, and I made a very big deal about it without realizing that we actually had to go back to the 3 boxes at one point. And then the kids were like, "But Miss Keane, you said we'd graduated." And then I was like, yep, we did, but Miss Keane didn't read the manual. Whoopsie. But it was nice for them to see that they were actually moving up and getting better.
Yeah. The last recommendation that the article makes is ensure that explicit connections are made between the learning from everyday classroom teaching and these structured interventions. We kind of said that before, but the fact that it's the final recommendation, I think, really drives home how important this is. We don't want students to feel like they're being pulled out of class to do something random and irrelevant. And we also can't leave them to draw those connections themselves. It is important to help them see what's happening in class and what you're doing in these interventions and how the intervention is supporting them to engage in what's happening in their class. And the only way you can do that is by communicating with the teacher.
Amen. If you learn nothing else from this episode, if you've made it this far, communicate.
It is so hard though. I think, the busyness of our days, our weeks, things creep up on us. People arrive at our door. We forget what we were meant to do. Our encouragement is, wherever possible, to find the strategy that works for you to integrate how you can plan well for your TA. The first step is knowing that they're going to be there. Whether it's setting an alarm that goes off on your phone, on a weekly basis on the day that you know that you have a TA, as just like a trigger to remind you that that's going to happen. Or whether you put it in your calendar so that it alerts you, or if you're good at using your paper diary, putting it in there, wherever works. But the first step to planning for using your TA well is knowing that they're going to be there. And then my other piece of advice, like I said before, is communicate with them as much as you can beforehand for well in advance. as far in advance as you can so that they have an idea of where you're going with your class, so that worst case scenario, they do arrive on a day that you forgot they were coming, they sort of know the context in which they're arriving into. We want to recognize that TAs have a massive role in our schools. We are so thankful for them and want to really encourage you to look for ways to use them well to support you in your teaching role and to support your students in their learning.
Well, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. We really love just having a good old chat between us, Sarah and I, but it is really nice to know that there are some of you guys out there. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to check out our Instagram, which is at Teaching Together the podcast, and join our Facebook community where we're trying to create a bit of a hub of knowledge and resources and things that we link to in the show notes. So if you want to nerd out even more with Sierra and I, please go to Facebook.
We are also hosting a giveaway on Instagram at the moment with Lux Learning Hub, where you can win yourself some very snazzy teacher stamps or personalized stickers. So make sure you go and enter that if you haven't already.
Don't forget to hit follow on the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you love us, please leave us a 5-star review.